In our fifth story in the countdown, Dick Cheney is newly portrayed as a power-obsessed prophet of doom. And that was by the most sympathetic biographer in the world, perhaps. President Bush's transfer of power to his second-in-command before going under sedation Saturday morning, we can all admit, having been mere formality. The polyps removed from Mr. Bush's colon, benign, that process as expected, gratefully a formality. Your joke about what else might have been found there, just as much of a formality. But according to biographer Stephen Hayes, it may be the president himself, reduced to the status of a formality, portrayed as little more than a bit player in his own administration, with the vice president in charge of everything from energy policy to the war on terror to the run-up to the war in Iraq. A rare incident when Mr. Bush exercised the powers of his office, his decision to replace Donald Rumsfeld as defense secretary after last year's election. Mr. Hayes revealing that the vice president did not agree with that decision and was prepared to say so publicly if he had been asked. He was never asked. As for the war that Cheney and Rumsfeld lied this nation into, the vice president apparently telling Mr. Hayes, a staff writer for the conservative magazine The Weekly Standard, that he now admits the post-war mechanism for governing Iraq, the Coalition Provisional Authority, was a mistake, that it would have been better to let the Iraqis immediately govern themselves. Another mistake? Mr. Hayes telling our own Tim Russert on Meet the Press yesterday that Mr. Cheney regretted having said that the Iraqi insurgency was in its, quote, last throes.
Yeah, he said it was obviously wrong for him to have said that. And what he said was he had been reading reports that Zarqawi was on the run, that they were getting close to getting him, and that at this point it looked like that was going to be sort of a marker. And you know, one of the things he said to me as I conducted these interviews was that he thought that there would be these markers, and these markers, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the elections, Zarqawi's death, would contribute to sort of a turnaround, and they didn't, and he said that comment was obviously wrong.
And no doubts about the war in Iraq, no second guessing.
Zero. I think what he says is what we've got to do is a better job communicating that this war in Iraq is a central part of the broader war.
That's right. Keep perpetuating the lie that the conflict in Iraq is in any way connected to the terrorist organization that continues to rebuild itself unchecked in the tribal areas of Pakistan. Of course, there is always the slim chance that Mr. Cheney does not know the difference between the core organization of al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda in Iraq, given that 4 years ago he could not distinguish between Private Jessica Lynch and pop singer Jessica Simpson. Biographer Hayes revealing for some reason that when Mr. Cheney was to throw out the first pitch before a Cincinnati Reds home game in 2004, his staff had informed him that Ms. Simpson would be in attendance. His question in reply, is that the soldier who was captured in Iraq? Another revelation coming from the Bush-Cheney Director of National Intelligence, Mike McConnell, who long before taking the job seemed to believe that the administration had manipulated the intelligence on Iraq. Quoting him from this book, as a former Intel pro, when you don't like the answer and you set up your own thing, you tend to get the answer you want. You hire people who think like you do or want to satisfy the boss. I've read much more about the current set of players, and they did set up a whole new interpretation because they didn't like the answers. They've gotten results that, in my view, now have been disastrous. Of course, those reservations were not enough to keep Admiral McConnell from taking his relatively new gig. His current employment would explain why he was backing way off his assessment during his own Q&A session with Tim Russert.
Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. I believed it at the time, and I mostly believed it because of my experience as intelligence officer for General Powell in the first Gulf War. I knew they had them. I knew Saddam had killed 300,000 of his own countrymen. He had engaged in 2 wars. He had those weapons, so I believed it. What I believe happened is that the community allowed itself to be lulled into making the call on information, in some cases from people who thought they had them. Even Saddam's generals thought they had weapons of mass destruction. So those shreds took us to a place that turned out to be not valid.
But did the policymakers hype the intelligence?
That's a judgment that I think the American people will have to make.
You are correct, sir. Time now to call in our own Richard Wolff, senior White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
On top of the many anecdotes sprinkled throughout this biography of the Vice President, your colleague at Newsweek, Evan Thomas, in his assessment of the book, painted this wonderful portrait of what it is that makes Mr. Cheney so gloomy, this aforementioned prophet of doom stuff. There's the bit of the chicken and eggs scenario here that Mr. Thomas uses and concludes by saying it's possible that by striking out at imagined demons that the Vice President actually is creating real ones, the administration's war on terror policy in a nutshell. Might the Vice President, Richard, be his own worst enemy? Might he be our worst enemy?
Well,